Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. Today on the show, I'm very excited to welcome Jonathan Baker, who is the practice lead at the M&A firm Punctuation. Punctuation advises small to mid-sized marketing services and digital firms on transactions and preparing for sales. Previously, Jonathan was co-founder at Monday Night Brewing, which is a brewery he helped grow to 5 locations and 130 plus employees. So without further ado, please give it up for Jonathan Baker. Jonathan, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. My first question is, what lessons do you feel are most transferable from breweries to agencies?
Oh my gosh. I think the people leading side of things is certainly a big one. There are kind of inflection points as you grow a brewery, and I thought it might be unique to breweries, but it's really a business where you have to add, another layer of management at like 25 people. 50 people is kind of the next one. And beyond that, just the mindset of problem solving is always important.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I have other places I could go with this, but that's kind of an interesting point. So how do you see the mindset of problem solving change in different stages of agency life when you're encountering these organizations at different levels?
I think it's a shift of the responsibility of the work over time. And so at the outset, you're doing everything, right? I mean, even if you have a small team, you're doing the billing, you're chasing down AR, you're writing the proposals, you're doing the work. And then as you grow, you start to have folks who, maybe they're jack of all trades type folks to start. Then the bigger you get, the more you realize you need specialists in those positions. And so you bring on specialists. And over time, the problems become things that are just kind of outside the realm of any particular specialist. And it's your job to keep your folks working and effective, right? So your job is really to just take away the roadblocks as they come up. And that can often be other people. So I think the problems become more people-centric the bigger you get as well, which is like probably good news for some, but bad news for others. So you have to adapt just the way that you think about your role in the business.
Yeah. And I guess with that in mind, when you're working with, more sophisticated agencies that have figured this out and are, perhaps on the eve of a big acquisition or whatever it might be, what do you feel like they've figured out about the people management side that others at earlier stages haven't figured out yet?
I think the big thing they figured out is that perfection is not the goal, and you have to give up control in order to scale. And so there's this like tension, right, between do I know exactly what's going on and is it going to be exactly right, and can I be bigger? And the folks who have gotten bigger and gotten to the point where they can sell and make, a nice payday are the folks that have just trusted their teams and focused on bringing in folks that they can trust.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It reminds me of like other solid perspectives that I respect on that, like Dan Martell's book on Buy Back Your Time, which is all about giving up a lot more control. The idea that like having something done, obviously better than perfect, it means a lot more than getting it perfect. So that all makes sense. One thing that I've noticed as we've taken on agency clients throughout the years, when we get into aspirations and goals, it seemed like a lot, like in the early years of the business, when I started in 2014, 2015, 2016, people wanted to grow, people wanted to scale. It seemed to be almost cultural, like there would be this focus on growth. And now I would say that that's less common at least from my selection bias. It seems like the focus now is more on, we want to work with great clients that respect us. We don't want to work crazy hours. We want to build a solid business. It's less of this like pie in the sky number go up sort of mentality. So my questions are like, first, do you feel like you're observing a similar dynamic? And if so, like, what do you think's behind that? Or if it's a different dynamic, would love to hear your perspective.
I think that's true. And I think COVID actually has some blame. I think COVID really showed the vulnerability of a large agency, right? Having so much just fixed monthly expenses that you have to pay, which means you just have to keep selling, have to keep generating revenue. And once you reach a point in your career where you have to make really tough choices, right? About laying people off or furloughing, then you realize like maybe growth shouldn't be the goal. Some folks, I think mentally are built for it more than others. And I think what you're seeing now is people recognizing where their strengths and weaknesses are, and also recognizing that they started these businesses for themselves. And so the business needs to serve them and their goals. And that often doesn't mean growth. I mean, honestly, you can become less profitable and grow pretty easily. Like growth in revenue does not equal growth in profit. And even then, it can just be not fun.
Yeah, it reminds me of like there was a slightly previous era where you would see agencies all the time talk about their revenues while including media spend. And like it's you don't see that as much anymore, but I remember even back then being like, wait a second, that's not really your money.
I mean, I still see that when
yeah. I imagine you would, like with the number of agencies you guys are working with. So to maybe take a step back a little bit, would you mind talking about just your day-to-day a little bit? Like at what stage you're encountering agencies and when you're working with them from day one versus day 100 or 300, like what does the work tend to look like?
Yeah. So we have an advisory practice as well as an M&A practice. And so I would say maybe half of our clients enter through the advisory piece of the business. And so we're helping them with their positioning or, developing lead generation plans. It's something you're very familiar with. And then later on, they come back and they're like, okay, we've implemented everything. Now we're ready to sell. But the other half of folks are coming in usually through, a smaller engagement like a valuation or something like that. Most of our work is project based. Well, 100% of it really. So we'll tend to do, one project every 2 or 3 years with a client, and then they come back. And it really is on the M&A side, it's a long wait. We're trying to meet them where they are, give them value where we can, answer questions when they have them. But, you're building towards something, and then we're hopefully ready to help you realize that once you're there. So we're just trying to kind of hold hands along the way.
Yeah. I just was jotting down different jumping off points from that. I think the first one is let's talk about lead gen a little bit. I think there's a lot of ways to arrive at an ideal lead gen situation, but can you talk about your experience and what your stronger agency clients look like from a lead gen perspective?
Yeah, I think broadly, our advice is to build a lead gen plan around yourself and your personality. Because if you're going to build this amazing lead gen plan, but every time you look at it, you like have a panic attack, then you're never going to do it. So build a lead gen plan that you aren't ashamed to implement or scared to implement, something you're kind of excited about. So that, for some folks, that could be writing a book, hosting a podcast. For others, it could be speaking, articles, cold email campaigns. And you kind of have to put these pieces together. And then the second big piece that we try to advise clients is to not do too much. So choose 2 or 3 things and focus on those. Don't assume that you have to have an active Instagram to win work, because I would argue that's false.
Yeah, and it's probably something that people that sell active Instagram programs will talk a lot about, right? So it almost reminds me of, I don't remember where I heard this, might have been a study or an interview, but it was something like a panel of famous doctors, and they got asked, what's the best exercise I can do, right? And so everybody's expecting, whatever, running or CrossFit or some version of it. And they were like, oh, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it's just something you can maintain. You can just keep doing.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. The ability to maintain it is more important than what it is.
Yeah, I think that's big. With that, I guess like the clients you're working with, how are they answering the who question, right? Because I think that's really tough. Most agency teams, there's an owner split between a million different things. Maybe eventually they're hiring that biz dev role, but even so, that person's going to be split between proposals and client service and that sort of thing. How are they answering the who question with lead gen?
I think the reality, and we're working with small to mid-sized agencies, the reality is it ends with the founder. And, there's like kind of degrees of reliance on the founder, but the business development program really has to have founder involvement in order to be successful. It's really difficult to find that diamond in the rough salesperson who's going to be able to close business in a way that the founder could. And so it's founder first, and then you kind of look at all the activities that you've signed up to do, and what of those things can you most easily outsource to someone on the team, and you start kind of pulling those things out.
Yeah. And when we're doing targeted email outreach and that sort of thing, we've seen a similar dynamic in that the classic SDR model where you're going to go get this like wet behind the ears salesperson to go get the CMO of P&G to have a call with you is probably wishful thinking, right? So it doesn't mean the founder has to do everything, but they're definitely involved usually for a while. So that makes a lot of sense. Another thing you mentioned a second ago is valuation. This is getting towards a question that I hate asking, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But the reason I hate it is because it's one of those kind of shiny object questions. Whenever I have M&A people on, there's always a tendency to be like, what's hot right now? Where are the trends going? What sorts of agencies are getting acquired? But I think that just steers people away from doing the stuff they need to do a lot of the times. That said, I'd still love to understand like what's going into those higher valuations and what's new versus what's timeless.
I mean, I echo your thoughts about just build the best thing that you can build, and it's going to be likely more valuable than chasing some of these kind of trends. But obviously AI is super hot right now. No one knows what it means yet, but you just say the two letters and that can increase your valuation. There's a focus on recurring revenue, kind of becoming more SaaS-like if agencies can do that. Tight positioning is always helpful. It does narrow your pool of buyers, but that pool of buyers is much more interested. And, just generally digital, but not traditional SEM or WordPress website development. You've got to have some deeper expertise in order to get clients that are big enough to actually scale a firm.
Right. Can you say more about that last point?
There's a lot of digital agencies, but digital agency, like what does that even mean, right? What is a digital agency? And so I think what I mean is more deeper expertise within a certain code base or a UX focus in a particular industry or lead conversion within a particular industry. You kind of have to like pair a few things together within digital for it to make sense. But if you do that, you can really capture a lot of value. We're working with some agencies right now that focus on law firms, and there's, a content generation one. There's one that only does PPC and SEM stuff. And they are doing really well. I mean, you look at their books and they're crushing it. And it's because they have a tight enough focus on an industry that's, willing to spend some money.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious to compare notes. I've also found that that's the hardest thing for agencies to commit to is that not just specializing in general, but like that level of specializing, like we do X for Y. What's been your experience with that, and how does that process tend to play out, for that agency that's the content agency for law firms, for example?
It certainly is something that's hard for agencies to commit to, but what we argue is that you're not committing to it. What you're committing to doing is that being the thing that you talk about yourself, in those words. That doesn't mean you don't do the other work, but you're not trying to win that work. You're trying to win work that will give you the ability to actually increase your rates, right? And you can only increase your rates if you have a specialization. And so it's I would say, a long process to specialize. And it's not like you flip the switch. It happens one client at a time. It's a 2-year process.
Makes sense. A second ago, you kind of mentioned that and how understandably the pool of of acquirers could shrink. How does that tend to play out? And also, like, I remember when I used to work more with tech startups, there'd be sort of a trend of a lot of these startups, like really focusing on building relationships with their future potential acquirers, like from day one. It was like, that was, the tech startup world. So everybody just wants to sell and get acquired. That's all they're focused on. How do you feel about that? Are you encouraging agencies to do that? And if so, how do they tend to go about it? Or if not, how are you kind of thinking about building those relationships?
No, we're not encouraging that. I don't think that's a great idea in the agency space. Things move, change pretty regularly. And you don't want to lose focus on your business, your core business. And so starting to have those relationships, you can kind of take your eye off the ball, right? Yes, as a tech startup, the goal is very clear, and it's to sell. If you're running an agency, the goal is not as clear. Selling is an option, but it's not the only thing you can do, right? You could also just maximize it for the size that you want it, hire a really strong number two, and take dividends. And agencies are not just inherently as sellable as tech firms because they require people and clients that you keep selling to in order to scale.
Yeah. And I think that kind of brings us back to one thing you mentioned, which is the trend of agencies becoming more like SaaS. And I think you could argue that the reverse trend's happening as well, where SaaS companies are becoming more like managed service companies or agencies. We just had Marcel on the show, Marcel Petitpas, who we both probably know, who talked a lot about that and talked about how, like, I don't know how he phrased it, but one of the biggest frauds was when all these tech companies essentially just masked COGS as overhead. So they, all the client support and all this stuff, they just like put it under overhead instead of COGS, which it really was, in addition to how much it takes for them to acquire customers and all that sort of thing. Okay, Dan, let's bring this to a question. I don't have one. I guess, like, what is that trend playing out? Like, how are you guys seeing that play out with agencies?
The financials of running an agency are not complex. And so it's very hard to kind of hide things or restate, right? There's kind of just an expected way of looking at the finances of an agency. And we try to coach our clients into, shaping their books the right way from the beginning. Not only does that make it easier to sell because you're showing the potential buyer that you are process minded, you have things under control, you're running this like a business and not like a personal bank account. But it also gives you a clearer, quicker read on where you are as a business. So clean up your chart of accounts, make sure everything in there makes sense. Don't just use like the default QuickBooks, whatever they give you. Make sure you're using cost of goods sold correctly. Don't use it for things that are internal to your firm, for example, or not tied directly to a client project. And then, there's a slew of others. The big one, which I forgot to mention, was switching to accrual as soon as you can. So it's easy to run your business on cash just because it's simpler. And you can still run your books on cash accounting for tax purposes. But if you ever want to be acquired, you're going to need to switch to accrual. And so you can either do that now and just have it done, or you can pay a lot of money later on to have someone go back 3 years and do it for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm sure we could do a lot more of a deep dive on accounting. But another interesting question that came up is this idea of patience. And I think that if somebody's looking to get acquired, it takes a lot of patience. I think for you guys in a business model like you guys have, I'd imagine there's a lot of patience involved. And also so that you're not pressed to encourage people to make decisions that may not be the best for them, right? So it takes some discipline. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, it's kind of a big, broad question, but how do you think about patience without complacency?
That is a big, broad question. As a business owner, patience is something that everyone, I think, develops some kind of relationship with, because it is good to be impatient in some areas. It's good to be impatient when it comes to things like incompetence or underperforming employees. But when you are delivering a service to another industry, you are very much kind of at the whims of what's happening at a macro level to that industry. And so that's one way in which you really do have to have patience in order to kind of see a vision through, positioning vision. I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but happy to expand on anything.
Yeah, no, I think that is a good answer. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you guys might set expectations with agencies with that in mind? Like in terms of like what they're going to be up against to go from where they think they are to where they actually need to be to get acquired?
Yeah, so generally I'll also say you don't necessarily have to be at a certain level or size to be acquired. It's just the math is different and the deal structures are different. So where we start is trying to figure out like what is a size and profitability level that feels attainable to a client to get them there. Because not everyone's going to be at that multi-million-dollar level, right? And that's fine. There tends to be an inflection point around the 1 million in EBITDA mark. So if we have clients that are getting close to that annually, then we do try to push them up to that mark. But beyond that, we don't try to push clients too much out of their comfort zone unless they need to be pushed out of their comfort zone, like they're just not running good businesses. But oftentimes you can run a sub-$1 million great business, right? And it comes down to, what are your just goals as a human? Is this something that you're doing because you love the work, you love the team, the small team, you love you bring home enough money to do the things that you want to do? If so, that's great. Just keep doing that.
Yeah, no, that's cool. To go slightly negative, I guess, but sometimes it's easier to pick out the negative examples than to figure out all the ways that somebody could do it right. Are there any situations that tend to scuttle these deals at the 11th hour? Are there any like reoccurring, villains you tend to see?
So things always get renegotiated kind of during due diligence, and sometimes they can get renegotiated to a point where the deal itself has been bastardized kind of beyond recognition. And so that would kill a deal. Financing falling through on the part of the buyer. There might be, some cultural yellow flags that start popping up, and then it just reaches a point where you're like, I just don't think I can go through with this. And you might back out because of that. I think those are probably the two big things.
Yeah. That makes sense. You've had some posts about how hiring an acquisition advisor, M&A advisor, can be like hiring a therapist. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And in so much as that's true, how do you feel like, who do you guys feel like you're the best fit for at Punctuation?
Yeah. So having gone through the process myself as a seller, I recognize that it is not for the faint of heart. It's emotionally draining. It intellectually can be draining. There's just these, there's always highs and lows with any deal. You just don't know exactly when they're going to come and hit. And so you kind of need someone to be able to weather the storm with you. And, also recognizing that selling a business until you get to the finish line, it's a really lonely place to be because you can't tell your team, right, until you know it's kind of a sure thing. So you need someone that you can vent to, ask questions of, someone who understands you at some level. I would say we tend to be a better fit for folks who don't need things sugar-coated, that kind of want a straight shooter. I find humor in even the worst situations. So if that's who you are, yes, great. We try to make things super approachable, and we're not like happiest folks, but we are, I think, the most kind of honest. And so our close rate is not as high as others because we are talking our clients out of doing deals that could be viable, but we're just like, we've seen enough and we just don't think it's going to be a good fit.
That makes a lot of sense. Kind of getting towards the end of our time, what keeps you guys excited? Like, what are you working on over the next few months?
Well, let's see. We're working on some new tools to help firms know how kind of sellable they are. Like, where are they along that journey? I think there's a disconnect right now between firms thinking they're ready for evaluation and ready to kind of get that process started and not. And I think firms tend to think that once you get evaluation, that's when you're serious, right? But there really are some markers you need to be looking at along the way. And so we're trying to develop some tools to help folks kind of get to that point without spending a ton of money.
Yeah. What are some of those markers?
Well, again, it's dependent on the goals of the founder, but, a certain gross margin percentage, a client concentration that's low enough, right? You don't have one monster client. Recurring revenue can be a good one. Your positioning, how tight your positioning is, just absolute dollar amount that you're able to generate in profit, the amount that you're paying yourself. These are all things that can help set you up for success. And they're things that you don't necessarily have to tackle all at once, but you can kind of do them, over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's great, Jonathan. Where can people go to learn more and do all the good stuff you want them to do?
They can go to our website, punctuation.com.
Awesome. Sounds great, man. We'll have to do it again and dig deeper into this. And depending on when this comes out, may have already happened, in which case you're too late. Go next year, but Mind Your Own Business conference in the Nashville area is coming up 3 weeks. What's the date on that again?
October 21st through 23rd in Atlanta.
Okay, we'll see what happens with timing, but regardless, you know about it now. So, Jonathan, this has been awesome and hope to have you back on before long.
Thank you.